Board, Maureen Anderson, Planning and Building. Yeah, back in June, the board, after several discussions, approved the contract with Dubeck. And the board now, the complexion has changed quite a bit, and two of the champions of this effort are no longer here. That said, I still support this idea, and really what I think the energy element's goal is to provide a better framework for future development. And Dubeck's response to our RFP was superior to the other two, and I'll remind the board that we actually did an RFP, I think for $25,000 or $50,000. We had no responses, so we upped the ante and we got 3. I think this was in the middle of the price range, but and I know probably 2 of you might not have the response from Dubeck, but when you look at the proposal, you know, it really talks about paving the way. And you know, we have some things that are kind of showstoppers right now, one of them being capacity. We can't, you know, we're pretty much at the limit of getting the electrons out of here. But I don't think that that should result in a lack of long-range planning for us. I mean, at some point, we have to address where and what kind of you know, energies we want to support as a community, as a county. And you know, I think this was a really excellent framework, is an excellent framework. And you know, part of the cost too, remember, they're going to be doing significant environmental work. And that's good because that's environmental work future developers won't have to do. And that's the goal, you know, try to identify where we want resources and, you know, do a significant environmental work, and that way developers, future developers, can tier off that and not have to start from scratch. I mean, you know, we have, like I said, we have capacity issues, we have sage-grouse issues. All these kind of things are constraints that in this process we want to identify, and then conversely identify the areas that are most amenable to development. We have significant geothermal resources, and I really feel like that's something that's going to happen more than it has historically. But you know, we get a lot of people looking all the time. There's been a significant well drilled in Wendell, and it didn't really hit the temperatures they were hoping for, but it was a substantial investment, and I think that just kind of is indicative of the people that are out there looking for those kind of resources. But you know, I'm sensitive to the whole do a study sits on the shelf, and this is not a mandatory element of the general plan. But I think it's important, and I think from an economic standpoint, you know, it's something that we should focus on, and I think we have potential, I think especially geothermal and perhaps wind, but this is the framework. I think it's the right thing to do. But that said, this is a different board. It's your sandbox. You guys, I work for you. Tell me you don't want to do it. We haven't signed a contract. You want to spend the money on something else? Direct me in that, and I'll go get it.
Question. Larry.
I mean, it's just one, you know, when I looked at it, like you say, you know, to sort of forecast the needs and the wheres and the whats and the whens for energy. But I think, you know, for a government you know, or these agencies to do that without a major driver of it being the actual energy companies, you know, there are certain places where wind, for instance, will work, and places where it won't work, where it's feasible, not feasible. So for us to spend, you know, all of these resources and come up with a plan, I mean, it seems like the driver of the plan needs to be the, you know, the energies, if you will. I mean, who you know, and when I knew this was coming on the agenda, and I did make some calls and just to get some feedback, and I didn't really know to what extent they had been invested in the county, so I asked just to shoot me some bullet points, which I've included in the agenda item. But you know, they have like $4 or $5 million invested in the county, trying to make a go of it. And if we are going to do something, I think they need to have a major voice voicing it. But the other thing that, you know, when you go through here, like point number 1 on the contract, it's, okay, they're gonna review the current, energy element, which I had a look at, like I said, dated 93. Okay. And identify the needs for updated data analysis or regulatory content. So, step 1 is just gonna be to look at it and see if there's, you know, anything that even they request or needs to be done or updated or what have you. So, I mean, why not as a, so, you know, thinking, well, that line item is $9,900. So, I mean, why not spend $9,900 and have them look and study and analyze what we already have in place instead of giving them carte blanche for $152,000 or whatever it is, and spend 10 grand and get some feedback and let them, you know, pinpoint areas of our current one that you might want to look at and the reasons and what have you, and get some input during that stage from other heavily invested companies that are trying to partner with us. Then, you know, when you, you know, I did some inquiry, and I don't profess to be an expert by any stretch of the imagination on how this geothermal money is. I mean, I've asked a few questions. That's basically my knowledge of it at this point. But it seems we get in about 30 grand a year, and it seems like a wonderful opportunity. We get about 40% of the geothermal monies created. I mean, they're laying under the ground, you know, in our county. I mean, to me, I would say, why don't we spend a little bit of money to get some feedback from this company on what to do and what's okay, and spend the bulk of the money, like, promoting the resources that we have laying underneath the ground here. And instead of getting 30 grand a year, eventually build it to, you know, 4 or 5 times that amount. Those monies could be utilized. It just seems like to, you know, we have 220,000 and to spend 152,000 of it to write a plan that, as we all know, in most cases, I mean, is just another layer normally of bureaucracy. These things are never really business friendly. I mean, I don't think you know, that's just how it is. It could actually make it harder for people to come do business here. And then you have county policy when a partner comes along to do something, you say, well, we really love to help you, but back in 2013, you know, the board set policies that prohibits you from having whether a wind farm or solar farm. I mean, I don't see anything in the current one that we have that would prohibit anybody from doing business here. And whereas a new energy element or an updated one could actually set a policy that makes sure we're not going to have wind in certain areas. And maybe those areas are the only ones that are viable for companies. And then we need to look at it on a case by case. So,
Well, look, if I may respond, you said several things, so backtrack a little bit. You know, for example, I think you're talking about End Energy and their struggles with the Horse Lake projects. And, you know, we entertained 2 different applications, and consistently, there was no project description. That's a problem for analyzing a project. And I think a well-thought-out energy element would have helped them. You know, they would have known what the game plan is, what they need to present, what they need to tell us in terms of the project. So, I understand, and it's not meant to be argumentative. I'm just saying, there's 2 sides to that. You can either pave the way for people and tell them where you want it and how you want it, or you can leave it wide open. But when you leave it wide open, I think it's more problematic for developers because they run into all kinds of issues. Like, you know, basically Horse Lake's problem is BLM, not us. And we don't have an application to analyze because they don't know where they want to put things or how it's going to look or any of that kind of detail that you need to process an application through California. But, you know, it's not a golden bullet, or silver bullet to have a plan that tells you where you want it, because BLM said they don't want it on that ridge line anyway, and yet that's where the wind is, so that's where the application is. So what I'm saying is, you can still have a plan, and you still can have a safety valve. The board can do what the board wants to do, and you can build that in, that, you know, we can say that's not our preference. I'm not saying you can't make an application. But, you know, if you want to know what the community thinks, and you want to outline areas where you don't want it, and, you know, do you want it everywhere? That's another option. That might be the result of this process. We want to entertain it anyway. So I don't see this in any way trying to prevent development. But I think that it's important that we try to outline what the strategy is so that it helps the developer.
If we have a set amount of money that we've built up over the years in this geothermal, fortunately, it seems like, I just wanted to throw the idea about how about we spend a fraction of it and get some feedback on our existing one. And maybe we don't need to spend 152, and preserve some of that money to market the resources.
Well, that I have to defer to Ms. Fouch and have her. I just passed out what the allowable uses are for expending that money, and you know, if that's construed in there somehow that we could do that, that's fine. But I just want you to be aware that there are
it is to, you know,
like 12 bullet points where you can spend the money.
So.
But you can do anything you want. You can modify. We could go out with a different RFP, asking a different question, and you may get a response. You may not. You know, I mean, it's not a given that this company will want to, you know, do something different than what they've spent time organizing and responding to. They may, but they may not. I mean, it would be starting over, which, if that's the direction of the board, fine.
I'm just personally of the opinion that the necessity is to allocate 152,000 to a new, you know, one of these, perhaps isn't the best way to use that money, and we need to maybe focus on promoting the wealth and resources we have underneath the ground here. So that's what I wanted to have the discussion.
And Jim has something to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Lassen for initiating the discussion. I think it's a good one and it's long overdue. You know, back in the 70s, you know, alternative energy resources were a big item, and that was back when Jerry Brown was governor the first time, and he really pushed that in his administration, and I think he's doing the same thing again now. I guess we just go in cycles. And geothermal was the big item that we had here in Susanville, and when I was on the city council, we actually had the Susanville Geothermal Energy Project, which had great hopes and aspirations, but because of the resource wasn't, you know, huge, it turned out to be a lot smaller. It was a good resource, but it just wasn't of a sufficient volume to be able to handle the great ideas that we had in terms of heating buildings and sidewalks and facilities and homes and businesses and you name it, provide a relatively cheap energy source. And by the 80s, that project kind of basically played out, and you know, there's limited use of it, but not the kind of use that we were hoping for. And at that time, the county adopted or developed its first basically energy element, and it was a geothermal element. We were focused on geothermal, and the things that are in the public resources code was govern that. And there are fees that are collected related to geothermal properties that funds this particular fund, so you are limited in terms of how you can use it. By the 1990s, there was an aspiration to look beyond. You know, in addition to geothermal, solar was the other big thing. Wind was not really that big of an item. But by the 90s, there were a lot of other alternative energies based on basically federal action and tax credits and the like. And that was where the 1993 energy elements kind of evolved out of the previous efforts in energy, pardon the pun, but that was what drove it. And obviously the geothermal resources, or that fund, was a logical source to fund that kind of an activity because it all ties together. But the problem I had with those previous two efforts is from, you know, in terms of retrospect, they were written from a perspective that if you do it, this is what you have to do. If you want to pursue that, this is what you have to do. And it was basically put together by staff and by the consultants, and the industries that were involved really, other than, providing cursory input, really weren't the energy driving the whole movement. And I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Lassen. I think that's what's missing even today. And so I think what effort we do, if we're going to expend the money, as far as I'm concerned, it's not a question of if you do it, this is what you have to do kind of an approach. Is this is how you do it, and this is how you make it happen, is be the focus of whatever the new energy element becomes. The one thing that I would say that I learned from observing the last two processes, it doesn't matter, you can have all kinds of pie in the sky. We've had people wander through here with all kinds of great ideas. I've gone out there to the window, I don't know how many times, and watched them fire up these tubes and stuff, and how they're going to produce electricity, and use low temperature, hot temperature. They're going to boost the temperature. The only thing that was productive out of the geothermal out window was when they came along and brought in the wood chips, and they married those two technologies to produce power. That's been the only viable output that's taken place, and the county has done everything it could to support that particular project, and I think that needs to be taken notice. And obviously the energy element that was put together was in part addresses projects like that. But they did it because they knew how to do it. It wasn't because they were given any know-how by the county. And it's just a matter of get out of the way and let them go ahead and do it. So I think the energy element needs to be retooled. But the reality is, no matter who comes forward, pretty much all your alternative energies that have been out there only exist because of the tax subsidies that are given primarily by the federal government and occasionally by the state government, rarely if ever by the local government. So depending upon what the feds do with the tax code in terms of what, and Ralph Sanders will tell you standing here at the podium, that when he came in and presented these little plaques, 5 million tons of biomass residue consumed. That only happened, this is I think on their 20th anniversary back in 2008. That only happened because of the tax credits that the companies receive to do it. So it's basically subsidized energy costs, and it's obviously to offset the cost of importing foreign oil and whatever, and the wars that are associated with that effort. But nonetheless, that without the tax credits, you're not going to see any of those kind of projects, whether it's geothermal, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, or whatever. And I've talked numerous times with Invenergy folks, and they claim that their project doesn't really depend upon it. And maybe to a degree, maybe they're big enough and they can say that and get away with it. But the reality is it does. And you read all the literature, it doesn't matter. The project up Hat Creek, up there by Bernie, that one, it benefits directly from the tax code. So I think the energy element needs to define that part to it. I don't think we really have that as part of the energy element, because that drives whatever the outcome. The other part that we have to make sure is focus on, and it doesn't matter where the energy is at, and Ralph Sanders will tell you that. His big problem sitting out there where he's at, he's close to the geothermal. Without the rail line coming in, he's bringing in chip trucks, trying to bring biomass from the woods all around, out in the middle of the desert is what he's doing. We see those chip trucks roll through town every day. But he has to stockpile and bring in that. If he can find the chips to begin with, and then he has to transport it there. So location is everything. So transportation and transmission corridors, once you create the product, whatever comes out, primarily the electricity that would be generated is the primary revenue stream that's there. You can have all the wind farms you want, and they've been identified on the map. The energy elements in the past, the energy elements in the future will show where those locations are. They're really meaningless in terms of development site until you have the transmission corridors. And I think the effort, and I'll have to give Mr. Hansen credit for this, because this is something that he has talked about numerous times, and he's been at times a lone wolf on the board preaching that particular line, is that we need to beef up our transmission corridors, because you can have all the geothermal plants, all the wind energies, all the solar fields, whatever is created. But if you don't have the transmission facility or infrastructure in place, and Tom knows from his experience being on the Plymouth Sierra Rural Electric Board, without that, you're dead in the water. No lights come on. And I think that's the area that I think that if we're going to proceed needs to be given a lot of focus. The tax side of it, the transmission side of it. And I would say as an approach, if you recall last year, Mr. Lassen, we had the SIDS discussion, we had a grant, the state was gonna give us like $35,000 or whatever it was to write up this grant for like our economic development, strategy. And, we went, what was maybe 2 years ago, whenever it was, and, a document's created, sits on the shelf, collects more dust. We've got numerous of those going back, 30, 40, 50 years that I can identify. And we never really do anything with it. And I, as one board member, so I'm not grabbing any more reports. I'm not in favor of, send the money back to the state. Let somebody else spend it, give it back to the taxpayers, is probably what you should do, because they're not doing us any good. But we turned around and using the LADC group, the group that the chamber basically got up and running and so forth, and they took charge working with staff, and they wrote a document, worked with the consultant, and put together a document on how we're going to do it. Not if you do it, this is what you need to do if you're going to go down that path. And I think the SIDS report that just got funded in the recent county budget for this first year to get up and running, is a document that comes from the stakeholders in the community, and hopefully it's going to lead to some productive benefit for our local economy. To me, that's what the energy element needs to do, is have that kind of a focus, is how are you going to do it? Not, if you decide to tackle this, these are the hoops you have to kind of go through. And that's been the process in the past, and to be honest with you, I'm not interested in supporting it if that's going to be the case. But you're right on, I can support that.
Marty, if
You just gave me the job of trying to implement the SEDS report. So from an economic development viewpoint, the first policy question that you need to ask yourselves is, do you want to be project ready for energy projects in Lassen County? These are highly sophisticated investments, as Jim has alluded to, because of all the tax credits and other things. And the first thing they're going to ask, are you ready to take the project? Absent adopting the energy element, somebody's going to come to town and say, can I put a geothermal well here? And Lori's going to say, I don't know. But we can go to the planning commission, we can do all the secret work to get you qualified. That'll add a year to your process. With the energy element, you've given all these investors a head start by saying you can do it here, we've done the secret work, and we can move forward. So that kind of comes the policy question. If your goal is to encourage energy development, you want to encourage energy development.
my thinking is, I ask this question to everybody, private developers all through the state or all through the nation or all through the, earth, whoever, even foreign investors. If they're looking for a place to develop energy, and they look at the counties, whether it be, San Bernardino County or Solano County or Lassen County, I would think they'd go to the energy plan and look at it, to give them an idea, is Lassen County or Plymouth County or, San Joaquin County, is that someplace we want to go investigate and spend money looking at and surveying? And if you got a 20-year-old plan, is that going to have effect on on what they decide? And to me, it's economic development. And if you have an old fossil energy plan, these people may not even come look. If you got something updated and making sense, and of course energy changes so fast, so rapidly, 3 years it can be outdated. So is it economic development we're speaking of to have a updated energy plan, so when somebody from Japan or Minnesota looks and says, this is what Lassen County offers, the first thing they're going to look at is the energy plan. It's easy. They don't have to come talk to us, they talk to staff, they can just get a copy of the energy plan. Is that going to be the first step they use to determine if they're going to come to Lassen County and spend money? I would think it would be. And maybe, I don't understand, maybe that's not correct, but that would be my thought. So I think it's important, economically wise, to the community that we have an updated energy plan. And exactly what that is and how much money we spend, I don't want to spend $145,000 having some guy come in and put this plan together and we get done, we got nothing. I think that's Larry's concern, that is my concern, but I think we do need to have an updated energy plan.
This is a plan that will, if you move forward with this contract, this is just the start of the process. It will go through the planning commission with all the necessary public input, and you'll get a say in it before it's adopted. So, you'll have your say.
Right, we'll get that's right too. The money's spent then, but we don't have, I just don't want to, I'm like Jim and everybody, I've seen too many consultants get this money, and then what we get back, throw it on the shelf and it's nothing. And I don't want to do that. I want something that's going to develop.
I guarantee
the
you, in
economy.
20 years, in 2033, Mr. Chairman, there'll be a board sitting here, whoever is on it, and they're gonna be having the same exact conversation we're having now about the 1993 plan.
And you'll probably be on it.
And the 1993. And in 1993, the board had that same discussion talking about the 1973 plan. But I'm just saying is, what we need to do is break that cycle, and that's what I think Mr. Wassey
I
was
think we're on the
talking
same
about,
page.
you know.
Well, and if I may, one of the things I really liked about their proposal is they seem to purport that they will take the public workshops and the agencies and anybody we want to heart. And so, we will focus, if that's the direction from the board, on the industries, and to the extent they want to participate, we will hound them if that's the direction of the board.
Well, I don't think it's a question of hounding them, I think it's a question of directing them. And I think the question that Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think needs to be said. I mean, just recently, we took our trip to the Southwest, and one of the cool places that we stopped at was at Hoover Dam, and got to check out Hoover Dam. It's huge. And one of the things, and I take a lot of pictures, I thought I had it on this phone here, but it must have been on my other camera, so it's on a chip that hasn't even been downloaded yet. But I took a picture of one of the displays that I think spoke loudly in terms of, and I didn't think about it in the context that we're going to have this discussion today, but it fits. But it's a picture of the United States, basically the western United States, and it talked about how Hoover Dam is part of this larger system in terms of the network of distribution, the generating and distribution of electricity. And it validated something that Frank Cady, was on years ago when he was involved with Elmet. It's probably something that Tom has sat through numerous, probably conferences and workshops and discussions on it. But there's like a donut hole in the West when it comes to energy. And we're right on the western edge in the middle of this donut hole. We're just barely on the grid, but if you take basically from just north of Hoover Dam there in southern Nevada, and you go all the way up into middle of Idaho, you don't see a lot of transmission corridors. You go from basically where we are here on the western edge of the Great Basin, and you go all the way to basically Denver on the east end of the Great Basin. There's, so all the corridors kind of run around us, and you got Bonneville up north and Hoover down here, and you've got stuff going in Colorado and all up and down the I-5 corridor and stuff, and there's very little activity going across the middle of the desert. Maybe there's a reason. Two reasons. Well, first of all, there's not a lot of people, and second of all, it's country that everybody basically feels is no good, so that it's forsaken. And we just drove across US 50, and that was a beautiful drive across the loneliest highway in America. But the point being is that there is not that facility to do it. So you got a lot of wind, you got a lot of geothermal, you got a lot of solar potential all in this donut hole, but it's not being accessed by the moneyed interest of the country for a variety of reasons. That is what the energy element needs to tackle, needs to talk about how we change that, how we become part of the pieces that maybe changes that dynamic. Plymouth Sierra Rural Electric has pursued projects, Elmet has pursued projects, PG&E probably has talked about projects, or maybe these other companies, because they don't want to break up the stranglehold monopoly controls that they have, will frustrate maybe projects that are put forth by the public or by the small utilities. But the reality is, in that one picture, and I'll get it, I'll pull it out of my archives off the chip, and I'll get it, because it spoke loudly, and that's exactly the issue that we have here before us. How do we break that? And that's the discussion that we've had as a board for 25 to 30 years that I can relate to firsthand. And no one has come up with any concrete, viable way to do that. And that's what, if we don't do that with this document, with this initiative, I'm out.
Thank you, Jim. Tom, in there.
I have a question for Mike. Who drilled the slim hole for the test site on the geothermal?
Say again, I'm sorry.
Who drilled the test hole?
Okay.
And can we get
Oski.
Oski Energy.
Can we get the results of that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Some of it, the results are proprietary.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't even have all the results.
But I can tell you that.
Can you give me what you have?
We can certainly ask.
We can ask.
Yeah.
But the investment was significant.
I know.
Galen, how deep was that well?
6,000 feet,
Yeah.
thereabouts.
They call them
6,000
slim holes,
6,000
that's what they call them,
Yeah.
they're deep.
Yeah.
Now, I did a little research myself, and the Honey Lake Power Plant uses 5 megs of geothermal. The other one, the Amity Power Plant, which is not functioning now, is 3.7 megs. How do we get revenue off of those, and how much is it? I think Larry answered that, it's 30,000.